Hello everyone, this is the Spring Anchor tutorial series and this is your thesis statement tutorial. Here we go. So our goals for this tutorial are going to be to understand the major goal of a thesis statement, why do you need a thesis statement, and the different components that create a strong thesis statement, and ultimately understand how you want to present your thesis in an argumentative essay, which is what your anchor is. So let's review the prompt. We've looked at this a few times before. Let's take a look at it again. Using the novel Things Fall Apart and historical sources, analyze the motives for African imperialism and evaluate their impacts on African society. Consider both the European and indigenous perspectives. So the anchor is an argumentative essay, which means you're going to need an argument in your thesis. For an argumentative thesis, you need to have a subject. This is who or what you are addressing. You also need, obviously, to have an argument. This is going to be your opinion, your feeling, your point of view about the subject that you're addressing. And finally, you need a focus. The focus kind of narrows the scope, narrows what you're talking about to a very specific focus point. So the thesis is going to have a subject, an argument, and a focus, but it also needs to talk about European and indigenous perspectives. In order to do that, we have to kind of make sure that this thesis is well structured. We'll take a look at that in a moment. So to build a thesis that includes both indigenous and European perspectives, one simple way we can do this is through a structure that's going to talk about both sides, which we can do through an although and ultimately kind of a thesis. Here's an example of what that looks like. Although the Europeans thought they were helping, ultimately imperialism was bad for Africans. This addresses both perspectives, both the European perspective and the African perspective, by using a thesis with this although and ultimately structure. Which means you really kind of need four things in your thesis if you want to use that same structure. You need to have your subject, you need to have your argument, you need to have your focus, and also you want to try to maybe use that although ultimately structure. It's not required that you use that structure, but that's a pretty easy way to formulate a thesis like this. All right, so let's review the prompt again. The prompt asks us to use the novel Things Fall Apart and historical sources to analyze the motives for African imperialism and evaluate their impacts on African society, considering both European and indigenous perspectives. That's our prompt. Let's take a look at some thesis samples. Here's one. You've already seen this. Although the Europeans thought they were helping, ultimately imperialism was bad for Africans. Do we think this is a good thesis? Take a moment and evaluate the strength of this on your own. Is this a strong thesis? Although the Europeans thought they were helping, ultimately imperialism was bad for Africans. What do we think? Does this answer the prompt? Not really. It doesn't answer all parts of the prompt. Does it address two perspectives? Yes, it does. So it's on a decent start, but still could be improved upon quite a lot. Take a look at this. Is there a clear subject to this particular thesis? Although the Europeans thought they were helping, ultimately imperialism was bad for Africans. I think yes, there is. There's a clear subject because we see imperialism there. Is there an argument? Yeah, there is. Although the Europeans thought they were helping, ultimately imperialism was bad for Africans. It's arguing that imperialism was bad for Africans, but Europeans thought it was good for them. Is there a focus? Here's where we're wrong a little bit. It's a very vague focus, just bad for Africans or thought they were helping. Doesn't really tell us much about what this thesis or what this paper is going to be about. We can revise this thesis pretty easily. The original one, although the Europeans thought they were helping, ultimately imperialism was bad for Africans. We can revise it by adding a clearer focus and being more specific with our motives. So here's our revision. Although the Europeans believed that imperialism would help Africans, ultimately they caused political and social problems which negatively impacted Igbo culture. Real quickly, don't use this thesis, everyone's seen it, but let's take a look at what makes this a stronger thesis. First of all, we have a very clear subject, imperialism. There's our subject. It's in red. We also have very clear focus points, political and social problems. So we know now that the paper is going to talk about political and social problems caused by imperialism and in Igbo culture. Finally, we know what we're going to be talking about by way of an argument because of words like negatively impacted. We have our argument, we have our subject, we have our focus, we have although, and ultimately, this is a pretty decent thesis. So you notice in that thesis that I have political and social motives. Most people are going to be using three different motives: economic, political, and social. But notice that the thesis didn't say anything about economic motives. Let me see if I can explain why. It's really impossible to understand imperialism without talking about economic motives. but also Things Fall Apart doesn't really have a lot of economics in it. There's a couple of little moments, but they're not very good, and they don't make for a good paper, and they don't make for good evidence. So there's not a lot of, or at least there's not adequate examples to use as concrete details. If you don't have concrete details to support economic motives, you really can't use that. However, again, it's really important to discuss. So I would try to provide the context of imperialism in your introduction when you're talking about what imperialism was, when it was happening, all of that. I would introduce economics in that introduction, talk about how economics drives a lot of what was happening with this age of imperialism. If you can establish the context for economic motives, then you can get more specific in your thesis to talk about political and social motives. So if you're not using economic motives, that kind of only leaves you with political and social motives. So your paragraphs are probably going to be set up that you have political motives in one paragraph and social motives in another. Be careful with social motives. Social motives can be religious or it can be ideological, but don't make your paper about religious and ideological motives, because you'll end up saying the same thing. It'll be kind of redundant, and your second paragraph will be the same as the first. That won't make for a very good paper. Which means you actually have a pretty narrow window of what you can say and what you can write about. For your body paragraphs, you're probably going to be talking about political and social motives. Let's say you're talking about political motives in one paragraph. You're probably going to have a topic sentence that deals with political motives and mentions political impacts or impacts that happened as a result of those political motives. Your concrete detail is going to be about the political motive and your commentary. Then your concrete detail 2 is going to be about the political impacts. So this is a pretty clear structure for how to organize your paper moving forward. So that pretty much wraps up our thesis tutorial. If you need to go back and pause at any places, or if we went too fast, you can go ahead and rewind and rewatch again. Here's our concluding points that you need to make sure you took away from this. First of all, the thesis needs to answer the prompt. It also needs to have a subject, an argument, and a focus. And you also need to make sure that your thesis addresses two perspectives, both the European and the indigenous, and you can do that with an although and ultimately structure in your thesis. Then your topic sentences should also reflect that subject argument focus. So this is moving forward into topic sentences, which you'll see in a different tutorial, but your topic sentences should mimic your thesis, but be more specific about one particular motive and the impacts that were caused there. Good luck, and thank you very much, Mr. Mize.